Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I'm going to be talking about how I go about studying a tarot deck. This is a process that you might have heard me refer to from time to time on my channel. It's what I call my deep deck dive. I have no idea where I came up with that title. It could just as easily be called an in-depth exploration or an intensive study of your tarot deck. Regardless of what we call it, the underlying process is one of digging deep into the nuances of an individual tarot deck. When we explore in depth what makes a tarot deck unique, we can uncover the deeper layers of the messages, discover new insights about the tarot, and expand our knowledge of this practice. It is all about diving deep, exploring new ideas, and enriching our tarot readings by tapping into the unique energies and messages of the individual tarot deck. So before we really get into how I go about this process, I do want to mention that I've created a guide that walks you through this entire adventure. I mention this not only so you can purchase your own copy, but because I'll be referencing it throughout this video. I call it Tarot Bound, a guide to exploring your tarot deck, and you can purchase the digital version on my website at bohotarot.com. I promise this video is not going to be a sales pitch, but I did just want to mention that real quick in case you are wondering about the books and printouts that I'll be using in this video. Okay, enough of the icky sales stuff. Let's move on to my deck study process. The first thing I do when I'm getting ready to study a tarot deck is that I set up a journal that will be dedicated to this process. Now you can use any type of journal that works for you. I'm fond of the dot grid journals because they work really well for pasting in printouts and ephemera and still allows you those guidelines to write. I have also used line journals and blank journals and both work equally well. Today we'll be taking a look at a couple of my deck study journals. The first we'll be talking about is the journal that I have set up for my study of the Spiral Tarot. Now I haven't actually started on my study of this deck yet, but I've only set up the journal so you can see how I go about that process. Now I do want to note that everything I'm going to talk about in this first section of this video is totally optional. You do not have to do any of this prep work or add any of the design elements or creative touches that I'm going to show you here. You can simply take a plain journal and jump right into the study process. If you want to skip this part of the video, I will note the timestamp for part 2 in the description box below. So for those of you that are still with me, the thing I do first is decorate or write on my journal cover. Again, like most things I will mention in this first part, it's totally optional. But if you do intend to decorate or write on your cover, I recommend you do so before you put anything into the journal. I neglected to do this with my Moonchild journal, and when I went back to try and decorate the cover after the fact, it was a bit more difficult because the journal is quite full and doesn't lay flat. So for the Spiral Tarot journal, I did the cover before I put anything inside of it. Sometimes I do just a simple design like I'm doing here with the Spiral Tarot journal, and sometimes I do much more elaborate covers like I did with my Nicoletta junk journal. Both of those are study journals. I just took a different approach for how I put them together. So do whatever you're comfortable with. You can simply just write the title on the cover and call it good. That works just as well. For this cover, I'm using Sharpie paint marker, which is one of the best things I've found to use on this type of journal. Regular Sharpie just tends to wipe off even if you've let it set to dry for a while. So once I've done whatever it is that I want to do with the cover, I create a title page. Again, this is totally optional. And then I go on to create an information page. So this is the page that I will write down any important notes about this deck, its structure, or its creation. For the Spiral Tarot, I only have the little white book, and the introductory information is really sparse, so I've only dedicated one page to it. In the Moonchild, there's quite a bit of introductory information, so I dedicated 2 whole pages to that. Then I have my intention page where I journal a little bit about what the deck means to me, why I purchased it, how I hope to use it, what my intention is for this study process. It doesn't have to be a long drawn-out journal entry unless you want it to be. I think of it more as like a dedication, a sort of prayer of intention. It's more like a ritual process rather than a checklist of goals. So next I have a page dedicated to my first impressions where I will note what I think and what I feel about a deck before I begin my study process. It's important to note that this does not have to be an actual first impression, as in the first time you're seeing the deck. You can do this whole process with a deck you've had for years. The point is really just to record your impressions of the deck at this moment in time before you begin the process of digging deeper into this tarot. Next, I do a title page for the major arcana. You can make it as elaborate and as pretty as you want, but the most important function of this page is to note any correspondences and whatnots that are unique and important to this tarot deck. Basically anything that you want to keep in mind as you work your way through the major arcana. If you're just working with a little white book, there might not be much to note, and in those cases, I will usually just write down what the booklet has to say about the structure or correspondences in the majors. At this point, if I haven't already, I actually take my deck and I scan all the cards into my computer, and then I resize them and print them out to include them in my journal. Now, this step is completely optional. If you don't have the means or the desire to do this part of the process, that's totally fine. It is quite time-consuming. Although I do enjoy it because it's just more time spent with my deck. You don't have to go to this length, but I do it because for one, it looks cool, and two, it allows me to work with this journal even when I don't have the deck handy. It also serves as a visual cheat sheet for the cards in those cases where I've cut the titles off a deck. I always scan the images in before I do massive modifications. That way I have a picture of the original cards. If you don't have a scanner, you can also use your phone and take a picture of the card, resize it smaller, and print it out. But again, you don't have to include a picture of the card at all. What is important at this point is to count out or save out the pages that you will be using for your major arcana. This way, later on, we can jump around in the book while still keeping all of our card study pages in one place. So I just go ahead and print, cut, and glue each card in, dedicating a single page to each of the majors. Then I basically repeat the process for the minors. I don't do a title page for each of the suits, but you certainly can if you would like to. What's most important is to just get those pages blocked off in your journal so that you don't accidentally do something else on them. For the minors, I sometimes do a whole page, and sometimes I just do half a page, like I did for the Moonchild. This really depends on how comfortable I am with the deck. For the Spiral Tarot, I'm not really familiar with this deck, and I don't have a great guidebook to give me a lot of information. So most of my understanding of the minors is going to come from my own work with the cards, so I wanted to leave a lot of room for journaling about each one. For the Moonchild, it's a deck that adheres pretty closely to the Waite-Smith tradition, and so I didn't feel like I needed a lot of space to explore the base meaning of each card. I just needed some space to explore how this deck in particular addresses those traditional meanings. So I did just half a page for each of the minors. Again, feel free to do whatever works for you. So at this point, I have all of the pages set aside or set up for all 78 cards. I have my impressions page, my intentions page, and my general information page. The reason I set my journals up this way is because it allows me to jump around to the different exercises and activities that I do. I don't always feel like sitting and studying a card. Sometimes I want to do a reading, and sometimes I want to do one of the activities. This allows me to jump around and to work through the entire process and the entire deck in a way that feels very organic for me. Plus, sometimes it can be a bit tedious to just study a deck one card at a time before you can get into any of the fun stuff. I tend to get bored if I don't have that variety. So this process and everything that you'll find in the Tarot Bound Guide is designed to be flexible enough to jump around with a little bit of setup and planning. You can, of course, just go through everything in order, and that's perfectly fine too. But if you're like me and you crave that variety, doing this little bit of prep work allows you that flexibility and that freedom to jump around. So now that we have our journal set up, let's get into how I actually study the cards. Once I set up my journal and I'm ready to get started on my study process, the first thing I do is read the introductory material in the guidebook. This is the information that's going to key you into the deck structure, the artist's intention, the energy, the correspondences, all those important things that go into making this tarot deck unique. I think it's important to have that base knowledge with you whenever you're looking at studying a tarot deck. It just helps to provide you with a deeper understanding of the deck as a whole. In particular, you might also want to look for anything that might be unique to this deck or changes things up from the way we see it in a more traditional system. For example, if the elemental correspondences have been swapped for the minors, or if the majors have been completely retitled or renumbered, those are all important elements to keep in mind as you're working with the deck. Generally, I will note down just the key things that I want to remember and that I felt were really important, and then I transfer them into my journal on those pages that I have dedicated for that information. Next, I'll go through the deck and note my initial impressions. Like I said in the first part of this video, this does not have to be your first impression. It just needs to be your thoughts and feelings about the deck in this moment. You can do this with a deck you've had for years. It's just important to record your ideas about the deck before you begin your study process, because it's fun and informative to go back later on and see how your initial impression changes and evolves as you get to know the deck on a deeper level. We want to consider things like the artwork, the figures, the landscape, the energy. All of this comes together to create this particular 78 card deck, and I think it's important to note how you see those things before you dig into your study process. There are a couple of exercises and prompts in the Tarot Bound Guide that go into this a little bit further, but if you're just doing your own thing, which is totally cool, these are some good things to consider. The next step is to create a dialogue with the deck, and this is where we get to know each of the cards of the tarot. So I'll be looking at each card in detail, reading what the guidebook has to say, and then layering that with my foundational tarot knowledge and adding in my own intuitive interpretation or reflection of the cards. In Tarot Bound, I've included journal prompts for all 78 cards. These are unique to each of the individual cards. There are 3 prompts for each, but if you're doing your own thing, you may want to reflect and consider the message each archetype brings, how that energy might be reflected in your life, and then how that energy lends itself to this specific deck. So to give you an example from Tarot Bound, here we have the Fool, which asks, what new journey does this Fool depict? So here we're looking at that archetypal message. Number 2, what inner spark is beginning to stir within you? So this prompt asks you to consider how this particular Fool might show up in your life or represent an aspect of your being in this moment. And number 3, what message might this Fool have for you as you leap into your new adventure with this deck? So our last prompt really asks us to consider how this card energy affects this deck and how that translates to your work with the cards. For the minors, I like to consider the cards from both the traditional Waite-Smith meanings as well as the elemental and numerological associations. And then, of course, I consider how each card lends its energy to the deck. So for example, here we have the Ace of Cups, which asks you, what feeling might this ace convey? So tapping into that traditional understanding of the Ace of Cups, what might that message be? Number 2 is how might this ace represent the energy of its suit? So here we're taking a look at the more elemental and numerological associations for the Ace of Cups. So ace being the 1, the beginning, and cups generally being of water and relating to our emotions. And number 3, how might this ace nourish your work with this deck? So this last prompt asks you to consider how this particular ace's energy will contribute to the deck and your study of it. So if you followed along in part 1, I did mention that I separate 78 pages out of my journal so that I can jump around. However, you are more than welcome to go through the cards in order, working your way from the Fool through to the World and then moving on to the minors. Or you can do like I do and just jump around. Work on the cards you feel called to work on, or just draw a card at random and dive deep into that study of that card. My process is designed to be flexible and to work at your own pace and in a way that feels organic to you, because that's the way that I work best. One of the important reasons why I do this in-depth study of the cards is because every deck is different. Even a deck that's, say, a clone of the Rider-Waite-Smith still has its own unique nuances that lend subtle shifts and energies to the deck and its meanings. Really digging deep into each card and looking for those subtleties is what helps you to deepen those layers of understanding. And then adding your own intuitive reflections, your own interpretations, is really what creates a very personal and unique dialogue between you and your deck. So whenever I finish up my in-depth study of the cards, I like to do what I call the Messages from the Arcana spread. And it's a basic 5-card spread where I pull 1 card from the majors and 1 from each of the suits to gain more insight into my work with this deck. You can find that particular spread in Tarot Bound, but you don't necessarily have to follow those prompts. You can also just create your own for each position. I also do like to do some check-in journaling throughout my study process just to see where I am with the deck and how things are growing, what I'm learning, and how things might be changing. These are really interesting to go back and read as you continue your work with the deck. I do have lots of prompts in the Tarot Bound Guide, but you can also just journal your own thing and reflect on your thoughts and experiences so far. So then we move into the deepening your connection. And this is where we actually do some spreads and some exercises with this deck. This is where I start to jump around. As I'm working my way through the 78 cards, I'm bouncing back and forth and doing these exercises in between my individual card studies. So I'm not going to talk about all of them that I do because then we'd be here forever, but I'll touch on some of my favorites. I generally do a deck interview spread pretty early on in my work with a deck. I have my favorite one in the Tarot Bound Guide, which is actually a 2-part spread called the Call and the Journey. But you can use any deck interview spread. One of my favorite exercises that I do with my cards is my Resonate Resist exercise. This is where I divide the deck into a couple of different piles, essentially cards I like, cards I don't like, and cards that I really have no feeling about either way. Then I select one card as sort of a representative from my grouping of cards that I like. I do a 3-card spread to learn more about what those cards have to teach me. I do the same with the cards that I don't care for or that I'm in resistance to. For this exercise, I use a second tarot deck or an oracle deck to do that 3-card reading. Another thing I like to do is to do any spreads that I find in the guidebook that were developed specifically for the deck. If it has just like a basic Celtic cross or a 3-card past, present, future, I won't do those. But if it has some unique spreads, I'll try to work my way through all of them. I also like to go find interesting spreads online and give those a try as well. I also like to incorporate some creative activities into my deck study, and I call these tarot crafting. So I like to pull some cards and write little stories based on the imagery that I see. I enjoy doing some art-related activities such as redrawing a card or creating a work of art based on the energy of a card. And of course, deck mods, because I think that's also a creative way to really get to know a deck, to bond with it, and to really personalize it. I also absolutely love pathworking with a card, where you really dive deep into the imagery and experience the world of that card and journal or create artwork based on that experience. So that's kind of my process of how I go about studying a tarot deck. I dive deep into the individual cards, I explore the structure, the imagery, and the meanings. I journal about what the creator has to say, I add in what I know about traditional associations for the card, and then I layer it with my own interpretations. I do a lot of fun spreads and activities to work with the cards, to get to know how they read, and to better understand how to navigate a reading with that particular deck. I explore the deck creatively, using it for more than just readings. I let it inspire my art and my writing. All of this together helps me not only to dive deep into a deck and really get to know what makes it unique, but it also adds to my tarot knowledge as a whole. It's a bonding experience with my deck, and it expands my vocabulary and my understanding of the cards and how they reflect their unique energies in a reading. So I hope that you found all of this helpful and that it will help you on your own personal journey to exploring your tarot decks. If you would like a bit more of a guided journey and some more exercises and spreads and activities, you can check out the Tarot Bound Guide. The digital version is available now in my shop at bohotarot.com. So thank you so much for joining me for this look at how I study my tarot decks. I hope that you found this information helpful, and if you have any questions for me, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I wish you the best of luck with your tarot deck exploration, and I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.